music producer TCustomz with TCustomz.com, and these are tips for creating a bass line for your sample beats, part 2. In my first video, I said this was going to be a 2-part series. I decided there were some other things that I wanted to cover in this series, so I'm actually going to extend it and make it a 3-part. So this is going to be 2 of 3. Just to recap what I covered in part 1. So the first tip that I gave was to study established producers. By studying their bass lines, that will help you to develop your own. The second tip that I gave was to learn basic music theory. Just learning scales in relative minor to major keys. That's going to help you to be able to identify the key that the sample is in, and in turn play a bass line in that same key. The last tip that I mentioned in the part 1 tutorial was the concept of detuning your sample. And this is really just nudging the pitch of your sample to make sure it's in key with the rest of your instruments. So the first thing I want to touch on for part 2 is filtering and EQing your sample. And the main thing I'm going to touch on is a high-pass filter. If you don't apply a high-pass filter to your sample, it may cause problems during the mixdown process. It's very possible that the bass line you're going to create will conflict with the bass line from the sample. So it's always a good practice to apply a high-pass filter to your sample. So let me launch Ableton and show you guys how to do that. Alright, so now I'm focused on the sample track. Now what I want to do is I want to apply a high-pass filter to that. I'm going to go over to the Ableton audio effects and I'm going to drag over an auto filter. So by default, it's a low-pass filter, so all I have to do is click this button and turn it into a high-pass filter. Now the next thing I want to do is set a threshold for the filter. You can do that one of 2 ways. You can either drag this across here, or you can enter a value down here. Normally for my sample tracks, I set my high-pass filter around 200 to 300 Hertz, and anything below your threshold will not come through in the sample. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play the sample through, and I'm going to toggle the filter on and off to let you hear the difference that the filter makes on the sample. So you can hear that when the filter's toggled on, you're getting less of the lower frequencies coming through. And that's really what you want to make room for your bass line. So the next thing I want to talk about is picking a bass sound to use for your bass line. All in all, I would say picking a bass sound really comes down to preference. Depends on what kind of mood you're going for, the track that you're working on. For this particular beat, I'm using a plugin called Spectrasonics Trillion. This is a pretty good plugin. It ranges different types of bass from your acoustic basses to your synth basses. Another bass sound that I tend to use a lot is a bottom bass sound from one of the earlier Roland Phantoms. I have the audio from that sound module recorded in. I loaded it into an Ableton sampler, and now I can play it across the keys like I would a normal virtual instrument. So if you haven't already found the key that your sample's in from detuning your sample in part 1, this would be your next step. This is where knowing some basic music theory is going to help you. Each key has a corresponding scale, and once you identify the key for your sample, you'll know what scale you'll be playing your bass line in. Alright, so now I've got the sample track with the high-pass filter applied, and I've also loaded in a bass sound from Trillion, and I'm using the Clicky 106 sub patch. When you're first trying to identify the key that the sample's in by playing your bass, it usually helps if you play the bass sound in a higher octave. Sometimes it's harder to hear the bass sounds when they're in their native low-end frequencies. So like I did with detuning the sample in part 1, I'm going to play the sample through and play the bass sound over top of it to figure out the key. I've got my bass pitched up a few octaves so I can hear the higher frequencies. So I've determined the key of the sample is C# minor. So now that I've identified the key of the sample, the next step is to transpose the bass into a playable key. So a lot of people find it easier to play in a key like C or its relative minor, which is A minor. So to do that, I'm going to drag over a pitch from the MIDI effects and to transpose a C# minor into an A minor, I need to pitch it up 4 half steps. So by pitching my bass sound up 4 half steps, that's going to allow me to play my bass line using all white keys. So I hope this offers you guys some more insight into the process that I go through into creating a bass line for a sampled beat. For the part 3, I'm going to cover what I plan to cover in this video, which is finding a groove for your bass line, actually recording your bass line, and putting final touches on your bass line. Until next time, happy beat making. Peace.